As March 2026, the most important thing to understand about Iran's refusal to negotiate directly with the United States is this. Tehran is not trying to say diplomacy is impossible. It is trying to say that diplomacy under coercion is not diplomacy at all. That distinction is the center of the story. Because from Washington's point of view, direct talks are supposed to be the road back to control. But from Tehran's point of view, direct talks right now would look like the final proof that pressure works, that threats work, and that if you squeeze Iran hard enough, eventually Iran comes to the table on American terms. That is why Iran's language has been so careful. President Masoud Pezeshkian said Iran rejected direct negotiations with the United States in its response, but left the path of indirect negotiations open. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has gone even further, saying Iran will not negotiate under pressure, threat, or sanctions, and describing the refusal of direct talks as a tactic, not a strategy. That tells us something very important. Iran is not slamming every diplomatic door shut. It is trying to control the form of diplomacy, because the form itself has become part of the power struggle. And that is where the real issue begins. For Iran, this is no longer simply a question of whether the two sides can talk. It is a question of what a direct negotiation would mean politically. If Iran walks into a direct room with Washington while maximum pressure is still in force, while military threats are still hanging over it, while sanctions remain a weapon, then Tehran risks sending a message to its own elites, to its rivals, and to the region. That resistance was temporary, but coercion was decisive. In other words, Iran is afraid not only of what it might concede at the table, but of what the very image of the table would announce to the world. The second layer is even deeper, and it is about memory. Iran's leaders do not view the current crisis in isolation. They view it through the history of the nuclear deal. From Tehran's perspective, the lesson of the last decade is brutally simple. Iran can sign, Iran can limit parts of its program, Iran can enter a framework, and yet the United States can still reverse course politically and restore pressure later. That is why distrust now sits at the core of the problem. Tehran is not only asking what Washington wants today, it is asking what any agreement would still be worth after the next shift in U.S. politics. Once that question takes hold, every concession becomes harder, because every concession risks being permanent, while every benefit risks being reversible. This is also why Iran thinks the American agenda is much wider than the nuclear file itself. The White House has explicitly framed its policy as restoring maximum pressure to deny Iran every path to a nuclear weapon, and to counter what it calls Iran's malign influence abroad. The 2025 White House fact sheet says that policy includes economic pressure, oil pressure, sanctions enforcement, pressure on shipping and insurance, and efforts to complete the snapback of international sanctions. A February 2026 White House action also laid out a mechanism for additional tariffs on countries found to be purchasing goods or services from Iran. From Tehran's point of view, that means Washington is not merely negotiating over centrifuges. It is trying to change the entire strategic environment around Iran, its economy, its trade, its deterrence posture, and its regional reach. That matters because Iran's own security doctrine is built on the belief that it cannot survive by relying on goodwill. It relies instead on deterrence through layered pressure, enrichment leverage, missile capability, regional networks, and geography. And geography matters enormously here. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway in this story. It is one of the main reasons Iran still believes it has bargaining power, even while under immense pressure. The broader war has already pushed central banks and energy institutions to warn of serious inflation and growth risks. The European Central Bank said the Iran war had made the outlook significantly more uncertain, with upside risks to inflation and downside risks to growth. In plain terms, Iran sees that it still has the ability to raise the cost of conflict for the rest of the world, and that ability makes it less likely to accept direct negotiations from a visibly weaker position. But there is another reason the current diplomatic moment is so difficult. The technical nuclear picture is worse than it was before. The IAEA reported in February 2026 that its Director General attended the indirect U.S. Iran negotiations on February 17th and 26th, and said bilateral negotiations were ongoing at that time. But the same report also makes clear that verification has been deeply disrupted since the 2025 attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran is not implementing the additional protocol. The agency says unresolved safeguards issues remain, and it repeats that Iran is the only non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT that has produced and accumulated uranium enriched up to 60% U-235. This means that even if the politics suddenly improved, diplomacy would still have to rebuild the technical baseline of trust from damaged ground. That is one of the most underappreciated points in the whole crisis. People often talk as though a deal is only a matter of political will. But at this stage, even political will would not be enough by itself. There is now a widening gap between what each side says, what each side believes, and what inspectors can actually verify. The longer that gap lasts, the more every actor starts to assume the worst. Iran believes pressure is designed to force surrender. Washington believes delay gives Tehran more room to preserve or rebuild dangerous capability. And the longer both sides live inside those assumptions, the harder it becomes for either one to justify a major compromise. There is also the internal Iranian dimension, and it cuts in two directions at once. Economically, Iran is under real strain. The IMF's current country page projects 1.1% growth for 2026 and 41.6% average inflation. The UK House of Commons Library says protests that began on December 28, 2025, spread across all 31 provinces, including areas usually seen as loyal to the state. On paper, that kind of pressure might look like a reason for Iran to compromise. But in practice, regimes under internal stress often become even more unwilling to appear externally weak. For Tehran, direct talks under visible U.S. pressure could be interpreted at home not as smart diplomacy, but as capitulation after years of sacrifice and confrontation. That is why Iran's refusal has to be read as a regime survival calculation, not merely an ideological slogan. The leadership is trying to preserve domestic legitimacy while managing external danger. It cannot afford to look like it rejected the United States for years only to bend at the hardest moment. It also cannot afford a full strategic collapse. So what it does instead is something much more familiar in hard geopolitics. It slows the process down, keeps negotiations indirect, avoids surrender optics, and tries to shift the battlefield from "Will Iran talk?" to "Under what terms can anyone still claim this is a negotiation rather than a diktat?" At the same time, Iran is also betting that the United States has constraints of its own. AP reported this week that one of the most difficult questions now facing Washington is whether it would ever go as far as deploying troops to secure or destroy Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. That report notes the stockpile is believed to be buried under the rubble of bombed facilities, and that many experts say fully securing it could require a sizable U.S. deployment on the ground. AP also notes the fear that if Iranian hardliners survive the current war, they may become even more motivated to pursue nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent. That is a critical point. Iran may believe that time hurts Washington too, because the longer the crisis drags on, the more the United States has to confront difficult choices between escalation, occupation-type risks, and incomplete results. So when Tehran refuses direct negotiations, it is not simply saying no. It is saying, "We believe time can still improve our bargaining position, or at least prevent our worst outcome." Iran sees value in endurance. It sees value in strategic ambiguity. It sees value in forcing the United States to choose between a narrower bargain and a broader escalation. And if Tehran believes Washington is trying to force a rapid settlement from a position of military superiority, then dragging the process out becomes a form of resistance in itself. In this sense, refusing direct talks is not diplomatic absence. It is a negotiating method based on delay, friction, symbolism, and cost imposition. What happens next is likely to be messy, not clean. The most probable near-term outcome is not a grand bargain and not total silence. It is a prolonged phase of indirect bargaining under pressure. Messages will continue to move through intermediaries. Public statements will remain harder than private contacts. Iran will keep insisting it is not negotiating directly. The United States will keep trying to show that pressure is working. And both sides will probably test narrower arrangements before anything larger becomes possible. The reason this is the most plausible path is simple. It allows both governments to stay rhetorically rigid while quietly exploring whether there is still a deal space left at all. A second possible future is a limited transactional arrangement rather than a sweeping settlement. That could mean partial inspection access, some kind of temporary nuclear understanding, de-escalation around shipping, or a staged sanctions formula. Not a reset, not reconciliation, just a narrower mechanism to stop the crisis from becoming even worse. This scenario is more realistic than a comprehensive breakthrough because the bigger the agenda becomes, the easier it is for Tehran to reject it. A smaller arrangement would let Iran say it defended sovereignty while buying economic or strategic breathing space. It would also let Washington claim progress without immediately confronting the impossible demands of a total redesign of Iran's security posture. This is an inference, but it follows directly from how far apart the sides still are, and how damaged the verification environment has become. The darker scenario is that refusal hardens into a longer confrontation. In that future, indirect diplomacy continues just enough to prevent complete collapse, but not enough to stop escalation. Hormuz stays unstable. Markets remain nervous. Verification gaps widen. Iran's internal hardliners argue that only a more explicit threshold posture can deter future attacks. Washington, in turn, concludes that anything short of deeper pressure leaves an unacceptable nuclear risk intact. If both sides move further into that logic, then diplomacy survives only as a way of managing escalation, not resolving it. And that is the kind of geopolitical limbo that can last much longer than outsiders expect. So, in the end, the deepest answer is not that Iran refuses direct negotiations because it hates diplomacy. Iran refuses direct negotiations because it believes direct diplomacy right now would validate the very pressure campaign it is trying to resist. Tehran wants talks, if they happen at all, to happen later, slower, more indirectly, and under conditions it can present as reciprocal rather than imposed. That is why this story is really about more than talks. It is about who gets to define the meaning of talks. Is diplomacy the reward for resisting pressure? Or is diplomacy the proof that pressure succeeded? Right now, Iran is refusing to enter a room where the answer already seems written in advance.